Love and the concept of second chances. A historical overview pre-18th century. In early human societies, romantic unions were primarily arranged for economic, political, or social reasons. Second chances in love, defined as forming a new romantic bond after the failure of a prior one, were limited due to social, religious, and legal constraints. Widows and widowers were allowed to remarry in most cultures. But societal expectations often discouraged multiple unions, 18th and 19th century. The rise of individualism and the concept of romantic love in Europe and North America began to allow greater personal choice in relationships. Legal frameworks such as divorce laws slowly expanded, providing limited formal avenues for second chances in love, though social stigma remained high. Literature of the period occasionally depicted characters seeking new love after loss or betrayal. But such examples were considered moral lessons rather than common practice. Early 20th century. Divorce rates remain low in most societies, but industrialization and urbanization allowed people to meet potential partners outside their immediate communities, increasing the possibility of second chances. Psychological and sociological studies began exploring the idea of recovering from failed relationships and seeking new partnerships. Widowers and widows increasingly remarried, often for economic security as well as emotional support. Mid-20th century. Cultural shifts following World War II, including increased social mobility and women's changing roles, led to more normalized second marriages and relationships after separation. Romantic second chances became more socially accepted, though often accompanied by legal formalities such as divorce settlements and child custody arrangements. Media and popular culture began to normalize the idea of seeking love again, portraying it as a practical and emotionally restorative process. Late 20th century. Rising divorce rates and evolving societal norms made second chances in love increasingly common and socially acceptable. Modern studies of relationships emphasize recovery from failed unions, the psychological benefits of forming new bonds, and the practical challenges of blending families. Online dating, social networking, and increased life expectancy have expanded opportunities for multiple romantic second chances throughout adulthood. Conclusion: historically, second chances in love were constrained by legal, social, and economic factors. Over time, cultural and legal developments facilitated greater freedom for individuals to pursue new romantic relationships after the end of a previous one. Today, second chances in love are largely normalized, though they remain influenced by social norms, personal history, and practical considerations.
Goody, J.
1983.
The development of the family and marriage.
In Europe, Cambridge.
Cambridge University Press.
Sherlin, A.
1990. Divorce and remarriage in the 20th century, New York.
Academic Press.
Cons. S.
Marriage. A History.
How Love Conquered Marriage, New York.
Viking. Timeline. Romantic patterns among former organized crime members.
1940s.
1950s. Organized crime was at its peak in the US and Italy, with well-established networks controlling gambling, labor unions, and illicit trade. Few documented cases exist of romantic relationships outside family obligations. Its members were typically constrained by loyalty and secrecy. Marriage within criminal families was often arranged for alliance purposes rather than personal affection.
1960s.
Law enforcement intensified efforts against organized crime,
Some members began considering disengagement,
though the transition to civilian life remained rare.
romantic relationships were minimal.
Fear of surveillance and reprisals limited social interactions.
1960.
Increasing arrests and prosecutions caused some mafia members to leave criminal life.
Ex-members occasionally
Form relationships with civilians seeking stability, but
trust issues persisted.
Divorce rates among former members rose slightly due to legal complications and lingering criminal ties.
1980s.
Sociological studies emerged documenting reintegration strategies for ex-criminals.
Many sought normative family life
as a mechanism for social rehabilitation,
including marriage and cohabitation.
Probation restrictions and social stigma continue to limit romantic options.
1990s.
Media attention on mafia turncoats highlighted personal struggles, including domestic life
and romantic
relationships increasingly practical.
Focus on financial stability,
risk reduction, and legal compliance.
Some ex-members
formed long-term partnerships with civilians who were aware of their past,
often emphasizing conventional roles.
Love, and the concept of second chances.
The second time, Daniel lived a quiet life in a small apartment above a bakery. Every morning at 7:30, he walked downstairs, ordered a plain coffee, and sat by the window. The routine had not changed for 3 years. 3 years earlier, his relationship with Anna had ended. There had been no dramatic argument. They simply grew tired, spoke less, and eventually decided it was easier to live apart. For a long time, Daniel believed love only happened once. After that, people simply filled their time with work and routine. One Tuesday morning, a new employee was working at the bakery counter. Her name tag said Elena. She handed Daniel his coffee and asked, "Do you want sugar?" Daniel said no. He always said no. The next day she asked the same question. Daniel said no again. After a week she said, "You always say no, but you still pause before answering." Daniel noticed she was correct. Over the next few weeks they exchanged short conversations, nothing very interesting. Weather bread, deliveries, a long winter in the city. One evening Daniel stayed a little longer. Elena sat across from him during her break. They talked about ordinary things, books they had not finished, places they had never visited, and how people sometimes start their lives again without planning to. Daniel realized something unusual had happened for the first time in years. The routine of his morning coffee had changed slightly. Nothing dramatic occurred. There were no grand confessions or sudden declarations. But several months later, Daniel was no longer drinking coffee alone by the window. And that was his second chance at love. The quiet second life. Marco used to live a different life. 20 years earlier, he worked for a small criminal group connected to the Italian mafia. His days had been full of meetings in dark restaurants, envelopes of cash, and conversations that were never spoken about in public. But that life ended after several arrests in his circle during the 1990s. Marco was never sentenced for the worst names, but the investigations were enough for him to leave the city quietly. By the time he turned 50, Marco owned a small repair shop in a quiet neighborhood. Most days he fixed bicycles, radios, and old kitchen appliances. The work was slow and predictable. That was the point. Across the street was a small bookstore run by a woman named Sophia. Sophia had moved there after her divorce. She preferred quiet things, tea, old novels, and the sound of pages turning. Her shop was rarely crowded. For months, Marco only waved when he passed by. One rainy afternoon, her shop had no customers. crossed the street and entered the bookstore for the first time. Sophia looked up from the stack of books. "Looking for something?" she asked. Marco shrugged. "Not really." He bought a book anyway. He did not read it that night. Over the following weeks, he came back several times. Sometimes he bought a book. Sometimes he only talked for a few minutes about ordinary things. Weather, broken radios, the slow business of running a small shop. Marco never mentioned his past. But one evening, Sophia said quietly, "You seem like someone who used to live a very different life." Marco paused for a long moment. "That was a long time ago," he said. Sophia nodded. She did not ask for details. From that day on, they closed their shops at the same time and walked home together. Nothing dramatic happened. Marco did not return to his old world, and Sophia did not try to change him. They simply shared dinners, conversations, and quiet evenings. For Marco, it was the first time in many years that the future seemed ordinary. And ordinary, he realized, was exactly the second chance he needed.
The days after Luca's visit were quiet, but Marco noticed things more carefully than before. He watched the street from the window of his repair shop. Every car that slowed down made him look twice. Old habits were difficult to forget. Across the street, Sophia arranged books in the window of her store. She did not know about the man who had visited. One afternoon, she came into Marco's shop carrying a small radio. "It stopped working," she said. "I thought maybe you could fix it." Marco opened the radio and began examining the wires, Sophia said casually, "You never talk about your past." Marco paused. "There isn't much to say." Sophia leaned against the counter. Everyone has something to say about their past. Marco looked at the radio parts for a moment before speaking. "I used to know people who made life complicated," he said. "Now I prefer simple things." Sophia nodded slowly. She did not ask more questions. Later that evening, as they walked home together, Marco realized something important. For years, he had avoided telling anyone the truth about his past. Silence had always been easier, but second chances required something different. They required trust. Marco stopped walking for a moment. "Sophia," he said quietly, "there's something about my old life I should probably tell you someday." Sophia looked at him with a calm expression. "Someday is fine," she replied. They continued walking through the quiet streetlights. For the first time, Marco understood that his second chance was not only about leaving the past behind. It was about learning how to be honest in the present. The conversation. A few weeks passed before Marco decided the time had come. The evening was quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows of Sophia's apartment. They had finished dinner and were sitting at the small kitchen table with tea. Marco looked at his hands for a long time before speaking. "You remember when you asked about my past," he said. Sophia nodded. "I wasn't always a repairman." Marco continued, "A long time ago, I worked with people connected to the Italian mafia." The room stayed silent. Marco expected questions, or perhaps worry instead. Sophia simply waited. "We moved money, arranged deals, and sometimes solved problems for people who didn't want the police involved." Marco said, I left when things started collapsing: arrests, investigations, people turning on each other. Sophia took a slow sip of tea. And now, she asked, now I fix radios and bicycles, Marco said, and I try to live quietly. Sophia looked at him carefully, as if measuring the distance between the man he had been and the man sitting across from her. Finally, she said, everyone has a past. Some are just louder than others. Marco let out a slow breath. You're not angry? I would be angry if you were still that person, she replied, but you're not. Outside, the rain continued falling in a steady rhythm. For Marco, the moment felt surprisingly ordinary. There was no dramatic argument, no sudden ending, just honesty. And sometimes, he realized, a second chance begins exactly like that, with a simple conversation in a quiet kitchen.